You are 14 years old. Yesterday, strangers came to your house. They sat on a bench, talked about the weather, praised your father's horse, and then said a sentence that would decide the next 50 years of your life. Your parents said yes. You have seen your future husband exactly twice, both times from a distance, at a village festival. Nobody asked what you thought. Nobody would have understood the question. And here's the part that is hardest for us to accept today. This was not a tragedy. This was not abuse in the eyes of anyone present. This was a good match, a successful outcome. Your neighbors were envious. Your mother cried, and then she cried again at the wedding. And both times the tears meant something completely different from what we would assume. For most of human history, in most of the world, marriage had almost nothing to do with love. It was a contract. It was an economic merger of two small family businesses. It was a transfer of labor, property, and reproductive capacity, negotiated by adults who had every intention of being fair and no intention at all of being romantic. Today we are going to take that machine apart, piece by piece. How the price of a bride was calculated, how old people actually were when they married, because the popular image is mostly wrong. What happened during the wedding, day by day, and what life looked like afterward when you discovered that the exit door did not exist. Let us start with a thing that makes everything else make sense. In a traditional agrarian society, a household is not a place where you sleep. It is a production unit. It is a farm, a workshop, a warehouse, and a pension fund all at once. It has a fixed amount of land, a certain number of animals, some tools, and a certain number of pairs of hands. Everything depends on the balance between mouths to feed and hands to work. A household with too few workers goes hungry. A household with too many mouths and no land goes into debt. And there is no labor market to hire from, not in the way we understand it. You cannot post a job listing for a woman who can spin, weave, milk, bake, weed, harvest, carry water, and produce 5 or 6 children who will grow into workers. There is exactly one legal way to bring such a person into your household permanently. You marry her to your son. That is what a wedding is. It is a transfer of a worker and a womb from one economic unit to another, with compensation. Once you see it this way, all the strange customs snap into focus. The negotiations, the haggling, the inventories of linen, the interest of the entire village. This was not a party. This was the largest transaction most families would ever conduct, larger than buying a horse, larger than building a barn, because it was irreversible. So how did the negotiation actually work? It began with the matchmakers. In the Russian countryside, they were called svati, and the role was semi-professional. Sometimes it was a relative of the groom, an uncle or a godfather, a man with a good tongue and a reputation for closing deals. Sometimes it was a woman who did this for a living in a whole district, who knew every eligible girl within 20 miles, who knew which family had debts and which had a strong roof and which son drank. She was a walking database. She was also, in effect, a broker who took a fee. The matchmaker arrived at the bride's house in the evening, often deliberately at an awkward hour, and never stated her business directly. There was a whole language of indirection. She would sit under the roof beam. She would touch the stove. She would say something like, "We hear you have goods. We happen to have a merchant." Goods and merchant. Not a metaphor invented by cynics later, but the actual formula used at the actual door. Why the indirection? Because a direct refusal was an insult that could turn into a feud, and because the whole village was watching. The coded language let both sides retreat without loss of face. If the parents wanted to say no, they said the girl was too young, or they had not thought about it, or the harvest was bad. Everyone understood. If the answer was maybe, the real work started. There was an inspection, and it went both ways. The groom's family came to look at the house. And I mean look. They checked the barn. They counted the livestock. They looked at whether the fence was mended, whether the grain bins had grain in them in March, whether the tools were sharp. A poorhouse was not just a poorhouse. It was a signal about the character of the family. Sloppiness was contagious, they believed, and a girl raised in a chaotic household would bring chaos with her. Then the bride's family went to look at the groom's household, and this was often called, quite literally, going to see the place. Because the bride was the one who would move. She was leaving her own family forever and entering a house that would either feed her or grind her down. Her parents wanted to know how many people slept in that hut, how many brothers, how many sisters-in-law, whether the mother-in-law was known as a tyrant, whether the father-in-law was known as something worse. And in that same visit came the physical examination of the bride herself. She was brought out, dressed in the best clothes the family had, sometimes borrowed. She was told to walk across the room, to speak, to sing sometimes, to show her hands, because hands told you everything about whether a girl worked. Her health was assessed the way you assess a working animal, and I use that comparison because the sources use it. Broad hips were a selling point, not for beauty, for childbirth survival. Now the money. Here is where it gets genuinely complicated, because there were two flows of value, moving in opposite directions, and different regions weighted them differently. The first is the dowry, the property that traveled with the bride. In the Russian peasant world, this was overwhelmingly movable goods, and the core of it was textiles. Shirts, towels, tablecloths, bedding, sheepskin coats, a headdress, sometimes a chest to hold it all. And the chest itself mattered, because it was the only thing in the world that belonged to her alone. Sometimes there was livestock, a cow, a few sheep, sometimes cash sewn into a corner of cloth. And here is the crucial detail people miss. That dowry was not decorative. A girl started assembling it at 8 or 9 years old. Every winter evening for a decade, by the light of a splinter torch, she spun and wove and embroidered, and the pile in the chest grew. That pile was her resume. When it was displayed at the wedding, and it was always displayed, publicly, item by item, the village was reading a document. 30 shirts meant a diligent girl from a solid family. 6 shirts meant poverty, and everyone would remember it for 30 years. Then there was the flow in the other direction, and this is the part that surprises people who assume the bride's family always paid. In much of the Russian and Ukrainian countryside, the groom's side paid too. There were payments called kladka, or podvinyechnya, money handed over to the bride's parents, sometimes explicitly to compensate for the dowry, sometimes to compensate for the loss of a worker. In Ukrainian and Belarusian regions, there were formal buyout rituals with names like vivod, the payment for taking her out of the community. And these were not symbolic sums. Documents from the 19th century record disputes, broken engagements, and even court cases over unpaid kladka. Think about what this means. A daughter was simultaneously an expense and an asset. She cost bread for 15 years. Then she left with a chest of goods. But she also brought in cash and an alliance. The arithmetic was genuinely close, and families ran it consciously. Fathers with several daughters and no sons were in a difficult position. Fathers with several sons and land to work them on were rich in the only currency that mattered. And the price was not fixed. It floated, exactly like any market. A girl's value went up if she was strong, healthy, from a respected family, known as a good worker, and had a large dowry. It went down if she was sickly, if her family had a bad reputation, if there was drunkenness or theft or madness in the line, if she had lost her virginity, which in a small village was rarely a secret, and above all, if she was older. There was a cliff. Once a girl passed the customary marrying age in her community, her stock dropped fast, and the family started lowering demands and raising the dowry to compensate. The same logic applied in reverse to men, less harshly, but still really. A groom's value rose with land, with a good household, with being the only son who would inherit, with being sober. It fell if he was a widower with 4 children, if he was crippled, if he was known as violent, and, in Imperial Russia, if he had not yet done his military service, because conscription could take him away for years, sometimes 25 years in the earlier period. A bride's family thought hard before handing a daughter to a man who might vanish into the army and leave her a soldier's wife, neither maiden nor widow, stuck in his family's house, doing his family's work, with no husband and no way out. At the top of society, the same machinery ran on a vastly larger scale, and it was even more explicit. Among nobles and merchants, contracts were written. Notaries were involved. In Renaissance Italy, dowry inflation got so extreme that Florence created the public fund, the Monte delle Doti, where fathers invested money at their daughter's birth so that 15 years later, there would be enough to marry them into a family of equal rank. When a family could not afford a competitive dowry, there was an alternative, and it was used constantly. The convent. Send the daughter to God at a fraction of the cost. Thousands of women spent their entire lives behind walls, not because of a spiritual calling, but because of a spreadsheet. Among royalty, the transaction was territorial. A princess was a treaty with a face. She traveled to a foreign country at 15, learned a new language, took a new name sometimes, and if the alliance shifted, she became a hostage in all but title. And notice something. Nobody in those courts pretended this was about affection. The letters are astonishingly frank. This match secures Burgundy. That match neutralizes a claim. Affection, if it appeared, was a pleasant bonus, like good weather on a march. Now let us destroy a stereotype, because this is where popular imagination goes badly wrong. The idea that everyone in the past married at 12 or 13 is mostly false. It happened, it was legal in some times and places, and it was concentrated in a specific social layer. But it was not the ordinary experience. Let us look at real numbers. In Western Europe, from roughly the 16th century onward, parish registers show something startling. Women married on average in their mid-20s, men in their late 20s. Historians call this the Western European marriage pattern, and it sits on one side of a line drawn across the continent, from roughly St. Petersburg down to Trieste. West of that line, late marriage and small nuclear households. East of it, earlier marriage and large extended households. In England in the 17th and 18th centuries, the average age at first marriage for women hovered between 24 and 26. In parts of Scandinavia, it was higher, and a large minority, 10 to 20%, never married at all. Why so late? Because in the West, you were expected to set up your own household before marrying. You needed a cottage, tools, savings. Young people spent their late teens and early 20s as servants and farmhands in other people's houses, accumulating a little money. Marriage waited on capital. Juliet may have been 13, but Shakespeare's audience knew perfectly well that a 13-year-old bride was an exotic, aristocratic detail, not their own daughter's fate. East of that line, and in Russia specifically, ages were lower, but still not what the cliché says. Church law, after a synod ruling in the 18th century, set the minimum at 13 for girls and 15 for boys. Then in 1830, the state raised it to 16 for women and 18 for men, and that remained the legal floor for the rest of the imperial period. Legal floors are not averages. The actual figures from parish records and censuses put the typical Russian peasant bride at about 19 or 20 in the 19th century, and the groom at 20 to 24. Not 12, not 14. Young by our standards, certainly. Married before what we would consider adulthood, yes. But the 14-year-old bride was an edge case, and it usually required a bribe to a priest, or a lie about her age. And it usually happened for a specific economic reason. A household desperate for a woman's hands after a death, or a family paying off a debt. What was genuinely near universal in the East was marriage itself. Almost nobody stayed single. 95% or more of adults married. In the West, a spinster or a lifelong bachelor was an unremarkable figure in every village. In Russia, an unmarried adult was an anomaly, a person who had failed at the basic task of existence. And in the peasant commune, it had a hard consequence, because land was allotted according to households and working souls. A bachelor got no full allotment. He could not become a full member of the community. He remained a boy at 40. Where the very young brides really cluster is the aristocracy, and the reason is the same reason everything else happened: property. If your marriage is a treaty, you want it signed early, before circumstances change. Margaret Beaufort, mother of a king of England, was married by 12 and gave birth at 13 and nearly died of it. Medieval and early modern dynastic records are full of betrothals of children and marriages of adolescents. It also happened among merchant elites. were a young bride from a good family locked in a commercial alliance. So the stereotype is not invented from nothing. It is a case of taking the habits of the top 1%, the people who left the most vivid records, and projecting them onto everybody. The peasant majority married later, married locally, and married someone their parents had vetted from a pool of maybe 200 candidates within walking distance. Which brings up something worth pausing on. Your marriage market was tiny. A few neighboring villages. Everyone was already half related. In many places, there were customs and rules about how close was too close, and church law on spiritual kinship added more restrictions, godparents and their families being off limits. So the pool shrank further. The idea of choosing from millions, of a soulmate existing somewhere out there, is not just modern in its psychology, it is modern in its arithmetic. Now the wedding itself. And I want you to understand that a traditional peasant wedding was not an event. It was a process that could run a week or more with a strict sequence, and every stage had a legal function as well as a symbolic one. It was the paperwork of a society without paper. Stage 1 was the matchmaking visit we already described. Stage 2 was the handshake, the rukobiti, where the fathers literally struck hands, sometimes through a cloth, in front of witnesses. From that moment, the deal was binding in the eyes of the community, and breaking it meant paying damages and taking on lasting shame. Stage 3 was the formal betrothal feast, where the terms were announced publicly, what the dowry contained, what the groom's side would pay, when the wedding would be. The village heard the contract read aloud, and the village was the enforcement mechanism. Then came the bride's period of preparation, which could last weeks, and this is the part that modern people find genuinely disturbing when they first encounter it. Because during that period, the bride cried, not out of nerves, as a duty. In the Russian north, in Karelia, in Vologda, in Arkhangelsk, there was a developed art form called the lament, the prichet, and the bride was expected to perform it, sometimes with professional help. A skilled lamenter, an older woman, would lead her, and the bride would wail formal verses for hours, over several days, in front of her friends and family. And the content of those laments is not shy. She sings that her father has sold her. She calls her matchmaker a liar and a hunter. She says her freedom is over, that her bright braid will be torn apart, that she is going into a strange house to serve strangers, that she will never again be a daughter in her own home. She addresses the stove, the doorway, the yard, her girlhood, and says goodbye to each. Sometimes she compares her wedding directly to a funeral, and this is not a poetic accident. Ethnographers have long noted the structural overlap, the ritual bath, the washing, the special clothes, the wailing, the procession, the sitting motionless with lowered head, the covering of the face. The bride was symbolically dying to her old kin group in order to be born into a new one. Her old self ends. That is the actual meaning of the ceremony. So why was the crying compulsory? Because it did two things at once. It gave her a sanctioned channel for real grief and real terror, in public, with community approval, once, so that afterward she could be silent. And it publicly affirmed that she valued her own family, that she was not eager to leave, that she was a good daughter. A bride who laughed on her wedding day was suspicious. There were sayings about it. Cry at the table, or you will cry at the pillar all your life. And in the middle of all this, there was one specific moment aimed at her body and her identity: the unbraiding. A Russian unmarried girl wore one braid, often with a ribbon, and her head could be uncovered. A married woman wore two braids, wound up and hidden under a cap, forever. At the maiden's evening, her friends unbraided her hair and wept, and after the church rite, her hair was rebraided into two and covered. From that day, showing her hair in public was a scandal. Uncovering a woman's head by force was one of the most serious insults in village society, serious enough to end up in court records. That is where our word for disgrace comes from in some languages. Her hair was her status, and the ceremony took it from her in front of everyone. Then the wedding day. Early morning, the bride is dressed and there are protective rituals everywhere, because this whole passage was believed to be spiritually dangerous. Needles or pins in the hem against the evil eye. Nets or fish scales sewn into clothing. a ban on the couple looking at each other directly at certain moments. The groom's party arrives and cannot simply walk in. They have to buy their way. The bride's brother or her friends block the door and demand payment, and there is haggling, joking, riddles. This is a game, but the game encodes the transaction. Money changes hands, coins and sweets and vodka, and the door opens. In some regions, the groom has to identify his bride among covered figures, or pay again for the seat beside her. Then the procession to church and the church rite itself, the crowning, which in the Orthodox tradition is where the sacrament actually happens, with the crowns held over their heads and the shared cup. It is worth noting that for most of the medieval period, in both East and West, the church was a latecomer to weddings. Marriage was made by families, and consent and consummation, and the priest's blessing was added on top, gradually becoming compulsory. The Catholic Church made a church ceremony with witnesses mandatory only at the Council of Trent in the 16th century. In Russia, clandestine marriages and marriages by simple custom persisted in remote areas long after they were forbidden. After the church came the feast, and the feast had rules. The couple often ate almost nothing. Sometimes they were forbidden to eat. Guests were fed enormously, and the seating order mapped the social order of two families now joined. Grain or hops were thrown over the couple for fertility. Bread and salt met them at the threshold. The groom carried or led the bride across the threshold so her feet would not touch it, because the threshold was a boundary where spirits lived. Then, at the height of the celebration, the young couple was taken away to a cold room, often a barn or an unheated storeroom, and locked in. And here the transaction reached its final clause. Because the marriage was not complete until it was consummated, and in many places the proof was expected to be public, the married women came in the morning. The bedding was inspected. In some regions, the shirt was displayed. If there was no blood, the consequences ranged from mockery to the return of the bride to her parents in disgrace, with the gates of her father's house smeared with tar, a formal act of shaming known across Eastern Europe. And I want you to sit with the picture. A 19-year-old girl, exhausted, having wept ritually for days, locked in a dark barn with a man she has met 3 times. And outside the door, 100 drunk people singing songs about exactly what is supposed to be happening. And in the morning, her worth as a human being will be determined by a stain on a sheet. The next day continued the ritual, and it had a specific function: testing the new wife. She was given tasks in front of the guests. Sweep the floor, while people threw money and rubbish on it to see whether she was diligent and whether she was greedy. Fetch water. Serve at the table. Bake. She was given a new name in the household, usually addressed by the diminutive of her husband's name, marking that she now belonged to him. Some regions had a ritual where she gave gifts to every member of her new family from her dowry, which was both generosity and a public accounting of what she had brought. And then the guests went home, and the actual life began. Here is what that life looked like, materially. In the Russian and much of the Eastern European pattern, the bride did not get her own house. She moved into her husband's father's house, the large extended household, sometimes with 3 or 4 married brothers and their wives and children under one roof. 20 people, 1 heated room. Her position in that hierarchy was the lowest of the low. She was the youngest daughter-in-law, and she answered to her mother-in-law, who ran the domestic economy with absolute authority, and to the household head, her father-in-law, who ran everything else. She got the worst tasks. She ate last. She was addressed with commands. Folk songs about the daughter-in-law's life are a genre of their own, and they are bleak. The mother-in-law's tyranny is a cliché precisely because it was structural. That older woman had spent 20 years as the lowest of the low, and now, at last, she had authority. And there was one person she could exercise it on. Add to that the ugly reality that in the extended household, the father-in-law's abuse of his son's wives was common enough to have its own name in Russian, snochachество, and it appears in ethnographic reports, court records, and literature. When the sons were away on seasonal work or in the army, the risk rose. There was almost no recourse. Complaining meant shaming the household, and the household was her only source of food and shelter. Violence against wives was not merely tolerated, it was normalized in law and proverb and pastoral advice across most of Europe for centuries. The Russian household manual of the 16th century, the Domostroy, gives instructions on how to beat a wife properly, meaning without permanent injury or public spectacle, because damaging your own property was foolish, and doing it in public was undignified. English common law had its own tradition of moderate correction. Village communities did intervene sometimes, but the threshold was high. What triggered the community was not violence itself. It was violence that broke the peace, threatened a death, or came from a man too drunk to work. Neighbors would step in if a woman was likely to be killed, not if she was merely beaten. And here is the mechanism that held it all together. She could not leave. Let us be very precise about why. Divorce in Orthodox Russia was a matter for the church courts, the consistories, and the grounds were narrow. Proven adultery, and proven meant witnesses to the act, which in practice meant nearly impossible unless someone wanted to be caught. Prolonged unexplained absence, 5 years. Physical incapacity present before the marriage. Being sentenced to exile with loss of civil rights. Taking monastic vows with the other spouse's consent. Cruelty was not on the list. Unhappiness was not on the list. Incompatibility was not a concept. The process was slow, expensive, humiliating, and it required literacy, money, and connections, which is to say it was effectively unavailable to 90% of the population. The numbers tell the story. In an empire of well over 100 million people, annual divorces in the late 19th century numbered in the hundreds, occasionally in the low thousands. That is a rate so close to zero that as a life option, it did not exist. In Catholic Europe, formal divorce did not exist at all for centuries. There were annulments, declarations that the marriage had never been valid, and those hinged on technicalities of consent, kinship, or non-consummation, and they were the sport of the wealthy. In England before 1857, a full divorce with the right to remarry required a private act of parliament, and across roughly a century and a half, only a few hundred were granted, overwhelmingly to rich men. So what did people actually do when a marriage was unbearable? They improvised. They separated informally, which was easier for the man, who could go to the city for work and simply not come back. Women ran away too, and if they were serfs, that made them fugitives, subject to return and punishment. Some marriages became a kind of cold coexistence, two people who spoke only about the harvest. Some ended in the way that shows up in criminal records, and it is a grim detail that in Russian 19th century murder statistics, poisoning of husbands by wives appears with a frequency that historians have found significant, using arsenic bought as rat poison, or in earlier centuries, ground glass and toxic plants. That is what a locked door does. When there is no legal exit and no economic exit, some fraction of people find another one. Also worth noting, peasant communes had their own rough justice and shaming rituals for adulterers, for wives who left, for men who abandoned families. The community substituted for the courts, and adultery itself was governed by a spectacular double standard. A man's affair was a sin, and if he was rich enough, it was practically an expected feature of his social class. A woman's affair was a catastrophe because it threatened the one thing the entire system existed to guarantee, that the children inheriting the land were his. Every rule about female seclusion, covered hair, chaperones, virginity checks, and reputation traces back to that single anxiety about paternity, in a world with no way to test it. This is why the punishments were asymmetric to the point of absurdity. In many legal traditions, a husband who killed his wife's lover received leniency. A wife had no comparable right, and often no standing to complain at all. And children born outside marriage carried the penalty for their parents' choices for life. Legally barred from inheriting, socially marked, in some places forbidden from certain professions. There was often nothing at all for the mother. In Imperial Russia and across Europe, foundling hospitals took in staggering numbers of infants, and the mortality inside them was appalling, sometimes over half in the first year. That was the shadow economy of a system where sex outside contract had no legitimate outcome. But death did what divorce could not. Mortality was the real exit, and it was frequent. In a society where women died in childbirth, where epidemics swept through, where accidents were routine, the average marriage might last 15 or 20 years before one partner died. Which means remarriage was extremely common, and it was fast, shockingly fast by our standards. A widower with small children and a farm to run could not wait. There are records of remarriage within weeks, occasionally within days, and the mourning period was often observed in the most minimal form because the household could not function without an adult woman. Someone had to bake the bread, milk the cow, spin, and mind the children. This was not callousness, it was arithmetic again, and it produced the figure that dominates European folklore, the stepmother. Not a fantasy villain, but a demographic commonplace. A woman brought into a house full of another woman's children, often with children of her own, competing for scarce food and a scarcer inheritance. The fairy tales did not invent the tension, they reported it. Widows had a more complicated position, and it was one of the few moments where a woman in this system could get real power. A widow with property and no living father-in-law could head a household, run a business, sign contracts, and refuse to remarry. In cities across Europe, widows ran workshops and inns and trading houses. In Russian villages, the soldier's widow and the peasant widow could hold an allotment in trust for her sons and command her own labor. So there is a real irony here. For many women, the freest period of life came after their husband died. But widowhood was also a fast track to destitution if there was no property, and the church put its own limits on the escape hatch. A second marriage was permitted with reduced ceremony and a penance. A third was strongly discouraged and required special permission. A fourth was forbidden outright in Orthodox canon law. Even the exits had quotas. Now let us come to the strangest part of the whole story, the part that should genuinely astonish you. Everything I have described was not experienced by most participants as monstrous. And the reason is that they were not measuring their marriages against our standard. Nobody expected a spouse to be a best friend, a confidant, a source of personal fulfillment, or an emotional partner. Those needs existed, obviously, because humans are humans, but they were met elsewhere, by same-sex company. And this is important. Women's emotional lives ran through other women, sisters, neighbors, the group they spun and washed and sang with. Men's lives ran through the male collective, the work team, the tavern, the assembly. Marriage was the third thing. It was the business. The measure of a good husband was that he worked, did not drink up the household, and did not beat you beyond custom. The measure of a good wife was that she worked, bore children, kept the peace, and did not shame the family. If affection grew on top of that, wonderful. There is a Russian proverb that captures the entire philosophy in 3 words. Endure, and you will come to love. Sterpitsya, slubitsya. Love was not the foundation. Love was the hoped-for byproduct, and it often arrived. Read peasant memoirs and letters from old couples, and you find real tenderness built over decades of shared labor and shared burial of children. Just not at the start, and not as a reason. And people did fall in love, constantly, the way they always have. But love and marriage lived in separate rooms. Look at the songs. Folk lyric across Europe is saturated with romantic longing, and overwhelmingly the longing is thwarted, secret, or doomed, because the beloved is not the person you are going to marry. Look at medieval courtly love, an entire literary system built on the premise that true passion exists outside marriage, aimed at someone else's wife, and is nobler for being impossible. That is not decadence. That is an accurate description of how the emotional and the legal were separated. In village life, the youth gatherings, the evening parties, provided a space where young people did flirt, choose, and pair off, and sometimes they succeeded in steering their parents toward the person they wanted. Do not imagine total powerlessness. There was negotiation, sulking, hunger strikes, and sometimes elopement, which existed as a recognized deviant option, running to the church and getting married against the parents' will, and then facing the consequences of a life with no dowry, no support, and no blessing. Some did it, most did not, because the price was ruin. So when did it change? When did love become the reason people marry? The answer is recent, and it is a revolution in the fullest sense. And it happened in overlapping stages across the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The first stage was cultural. The 18th century produced sentimental literature, and the 19th exploded it into mass culture. Novels taught readers something genuinely new, that individual feeling is important, that a person's inner life is worth a book, that choosing your own beloved is heroic, and being forced into a match is tragic. Millions of people learned to want something they had never had a vocabulary for. This mattered most for young women in literate families, and it is not an accident that the classic 19th century novel returns again and again to the collision between a young woman's heart and her family's balance sheet. It was the burning question of the age. The second stage was economic, and it was decisive. Arranged marriage depends on parental control of resources. If your only path to an income is the land your father allots, the workshop your father owns, or the dowry your father provides, then your father decides who you marry. Industrialization broke that. When a 17-year-old could walk to a factory town and earn wages in her own hand, the leverage collapsed. She could feed herself, she could save, she could choose. City life also destroyed the surveillance system. In a village, everyone knew everything. In a city of 500,000, a young couple could meet at a dance hall where nobody knew their families. The urban marriage market was enormous and anonymous. And out of it came something wholly modern: courtship as a personal project, conducted by the participants for their own reasons. The third stage was legal and political. Across the 19th century, European states secularized marriage, introducing civil registration and, gradually, civil divorce. England opened judicial divorce in 1857, still expensive and still unequal, and reformed it repeatedly afterward. France oscillated with its revolutions, legalizing divorce, abolishing it, restoring it in 1884. In Russia, the break was abrupt and radical. In December 1917, the new Soviet government issued decrees moving marriage entirely into civil registry offices and making divorce available essentially on demand at the request of either spouse. In a country where a divorce had been a near impossible ecclesiastical ordeal, it became a form to fill out. Rates jumped immediately. Then the state swung back in 1944, making divorce difficult and expensive again, and swung forward once more in 1965. Meanwhile, women gained property rights, the right to their own wages, the right to their own passports and residence, the right to vote, the right to higher education, and each of those quietly removed another brick from the wall that had made marriage compulsory. The fourth stage was biological, and it arrived in the 20th century. Falling infant mortality meant you no longer needed 8 children to end up with 4 adults. Reliable contraception meant sex and reproduction could be separated, which detached marriage from its oldest function. Pensions, state health care, and social insurance meant your children were no longer your only old age security, which detached marriage from its second oldest function. Strip the economics out of an institution, and what remains is the relationship itself. And when the relationship is all that remains, the only justification for staying is that you want to. That is why divorce rates rose everywhere in the second half of the 20th century. Not because people became worse at love, because the walls came down, and for the first time in history, the question was allowed to be asked: do I want to be here? So let us be honest about what we are living in. The love marriage is an experiment, and it is roughly a century and a half old in the West, less than that in most of the world, and in some places it is still contested right now. Arranged marriage remains a normal practice for hundreds of millions of people, sometimes in modernized forms with veto rights and introduction agencies, sometimes not. And our version has a structural problem the old version did not have. We now expect one person to be what an entire village used to provide: economic partner, best friend, lover, co-parent, therapist, source of meaning, witness to our inner life, and the reason we get up in the morning. That is an extraordinary demand. Our ancestors put those needs in 5 different baskets: We put them all in one. That is why modern marriage can feel simultaneously freer and heavier than what came before. We got the right to choose, and with it, the responsibility for the choice, and the loneliness of having no external structure to blame. I do not want to end this by inviting you to feel superior to the past. Those people were not stupid, and they were not indifferent to happiness. They were solving a different problem with the tools available. In a world with no welfare, no police worth the name, no pensions, no reliable medicine, no wage labor, and a real chance of starving if the harvest failed twice, the family was the only institution that worked, and it had to be built to survive, not to satisfy. They optimized for survival. We optimize for fulfillment. Both are rational given the conditions, but I do want you to remember the 14-year-old at the beginning, and the girl in the barn, and the woman singing that her father sold her. Because when someone tells you that traditional marriage was more stable, they are usually telling the truth. It was more stable. It was stable the way a locked room is quiet. The stability was not made of love. It was made of the absence of alternatives. And the enormous, historically unprecedented luxury that you and I have is this. If we stay because we chose to. Nobody in that village had that. It took thousands of years, industrial revolutions, wars, and generations of people fighting for boring legal paperwork for a woman's right to her own wages and her own passport, before a human being could look at another human being and say the sentence that now sounds so ordinary. I am here because I want to be. That sentence is the youngest thing in this entire story. It is worth understanding how expensive it was,